On the morning of November 14th, 2019, in the deep timber country outside Havenwood, Missouri, 12 men lay dead across 3 separate logging sites spanning 40 miles of Ozark ridgeline. The Missouri State Police would later determine that all 12 deaths occurred within a span of 18 hours, carried out by members of a single family over the theft of a double-bit felling axe worth approximately $40 at any hardware store, but carrying a weight no dollar amount could measure. The Leonel family, 4 brothers and 2 cousins, ranging in age from 38 to 62, turned themselves in without resistance on November 15th, their hands scrubbed raw, their faces empty of everything except the quiet certainty that comes when a man crosses a line he knew existed but chose to step over anyway. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. The Missouri Ozarks in the autumn of 2019 looked much the way they had looked for the previous 30 years, which is to say, they looked like a place time had stopped caring about. Havenwood and the surrounding timber communities had built themselves on white oak and shortleaf pine, on the backbreaking labor of men who understood that a tree took 50 years to grow and 5 minutes to fall, and that somewhere in that equation was the entire story of their lives. The mills that had run 3 shifts a day through the 1970s and 80s had closed one by one through the 90s. Bought out by corporations that moved the operations to Canada or the Pacific Northwest, where environmental regulations meant less and labor came cheaper. By 2019, only 2 mills remained operational within 100 miles, and both ran skeleton crews at wages that would have made their fathers spit. The men who still worked timber did so as independent contractors, selling loads to brokers who paid them a fraction of what the wood would fetch downriver. And they did this because it was the only thing they knew how to do, and because a man reaches a certain age when learning new skills feels less like growth and more like admitting defeat. The town of Havenwood itself sat in a valley where 2 creeks met. A collection of brick storefronts built in the 1920s that had seen better days and worse ones, and had settled into a kind of permanent exhaustion. The hardware store still opened 6 days a week, but kept shorter hours than it used to. The diner still served breakfast to the men who gathered there before dawn, but there were fewer men each year and more empty stools. The gas station at the edge of town had been bought by a chain, and the local owner had retired to Arkansas, and somehow that transaction felt like a betrayal, even though everyone understood it was just business. On cold mornings, the valley filled with wood smoke from 100 chimneys, the smell mixing with diesel exhaust and the faint mineral scent of the creeks. And if you stood on Main Street at 5:30 in the morning, you could hear the sound of truck engines turning over in driveways all through the hills, men starting their days in the dark because the work demanded it and because the darkness felt appropriate somehow. Raymond Leonel was 62 years old that November and had worked timber for 44 of those years. Starting at 18, when his father took him into the woods with a chainsaw and a cant hook and told him that a man who could fall timber could make his way anywhere because timber was honest work that demanded honest effort and gave back in proportion to what you put in. Raymond had believed that then, and he believed it still, even though the economics of the industry had proven his father at least partially wrong. He was a thick man, not tall but broad through the shoulders and chest, his hands scarred and calloused from decades of handling chains and axes and rough bark, his face weathered to the texture of old leather. He wore the same style of clothes he had worn since he was 20, Carhartt work pants and flannel shirts and Red Wing boots that he oiled once a month and resoled when the treads wore down. And he drove a 1998 Ford F-250 with 280,000 miles on it that he maintained himself in a shop behind his house. He lived alone, since his wife Martha had passed 6 years earlier from cancer that started in her lungs and spread before the doctors caught it, and he had not remarried or even considered it, because Martha had been the only woman he had ever loved, and some things you did not replace. Every morning Raymond woke at 4:30, made coffee in a percolator on the stove, because that was how his father had made it, and sat at his kitchen table in the dark, listening to the local AM station while he planned his day. He kept a notebook where he tracked every tree he felled, the species and diameter and location, a habit his father had taught him and one he had never abandoned, even though no one else he knew bothered with such things anymore. By 5:15, he was in his truck heading into the hills, his lunch packed in a metal box his wife had given him 30 years ago, a thermos of coffee on the seat beside him, and the weight of another day settling onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. The axe had belonged to his grandfather, Thomas Leonel, who had come to the Ozarks from East Tennessee in 1923 with nothing but the clothes on his back and the axe in his hands. Thomas had been a timberman in Tennessee, and he continued that trade in Missouri, falling oak and hickory for the tie mills and barrel staves, working from dawn until his hands bled, and then working some more because that was what men did when they had families to feed and no other way to feed them. The axe was a double-bit model, forged in Pennsylvania sometime around 1900. The handle replaced 3 times over the decades, but the head original. The steel worn thin in places from countless sharpenings, but still holding an edge better than anything made in the last 50 years. Thomas had used that axe until he was 70, then passed it to his son William, Raymond's father, who used it until arthritis made his hands too stiff to grip it properly. And then William had passed it to Raymond on his 50th birthday with instructions that it stay in the family and be used, not hung on a wall like some museum piece, because tools were meant to work, and a man who did not work his tools was not much of a man. Raymond kept the axe in a wooden box he had built himself, lined with old wool blankets to protect the edge. He did not use it every day, because modern chainsaws made felling faster and more efficient, but he used it often enough for de-limbing small trees or splitting kindling, or simply to maintain the connection to his grandfather and father, to feel the same weight in his hands they had felt, to make the same cuts they had made. The handle was smooth from decades of use, darkened by the oil and sweat of 3 generations of Leonel hands, and when Raymond held it, he could close his eyes and see his grandfather standing in a Tennessee hollow, could see his father working a ridgeline in the early light, could feel the unbroken line of labor and pride and suffering that connected him to men he had loved and men he had never met, but whose blood ran in his veins. Marcus Thiol was 41 years old and had been working timber in the Ozarks for 15 years. Having moved up from Louisiana after his second divorce left him with nothing but debts and a desire to be somewhere his ex-wives could not find him. He was a loud man, quick to laugh and quicker to anger, the kind of man who dominated conversations at the diner and the bar, who always had a story about some fight he had won or some woman he had bedded, and who seemed to take a particular pleasure in making other men feel small. He ran a crew of 5 men, younger guys mostly, and he had a reputation for working fast and cutting corners, for taking timber from sections that were not quite his to take, for being just dishonest enough that established loggers avoided working near him, but not dishonest enough that anyone had bothered to involve the law. He drove a new Dodge Ram with aftermarket wheels and a lift kit, wore Oakley sunglasses even on cloudy days, and made a point of talking about how much money he made, even though everyone knew he was always behind on his payments. On October 28, 2019, Marcus and his crew were working a section adjacent to land Raymond had been working for 3 weeks. Raymond had set up a staging area where he kept his saw fuel and oil, his spare chains, his come-along and cables, and the wooden box containing his grandfather's axe. He kept the staging area covered with a tarp weighted down with rocks because the weather had been wet and equipment left in the rain deteriorated faster. It was not locked, because in 44 years of working timber, Raymond had never had anything stolen, and the idea that someone would take another man's tools was so foreign to him that it simply did not register as a possibility. Marcus had seen the axe 3 days earlier when he walked through Raymond's staging area looking for a chain he claimed to have lost, though Raymond suspected he was really just snooping to see what kind of equipment Raymond was running. Marcus had picked up the axe, hefted it, made some comment about how it was a nice old piece and probably worth something to a collector, and Raymond had told him it was not for sale and asked him to put it back. Marcus had laughed and said everything was for sale at the right price, and Raymond had not responded because he had learned long ago that some men could not be reasoned with, and the only thing to do was keep your distance and let them talk. On October 28th, Raymond returned to his staging area after felling a section of oak to find the wooden box open and the axe gone. For a long moment, he simply stood there, unable to process what he was seeing, his mind refusing to accept that someone would violate the unspoken code that governed men who worked alone in the woods. He searched the area thinking perhaps an animal had knocked the box over, though that made no sense, and then he walked to where Marcus's crew was working a quarter-mile away and asked if anyone had seen his axe. Marcus was running a chainsaw and did not hear him at first, and when one of the younger men tapped his shoulder and pointed, Marcus killed the saw and pushed his safety glasses up on his head and asked what Raymond wanted. Raymond explained that his axe was missing and asked if Marcus or any of his crew had seen it. Marcus made a show of looking around at his men, asking them if they had seen any axe, and they all shook their heads with the kind of exaggerated innocence that told Raymond everything he needed to know. Marcus turned back to Raymond and said he had not seen any axe, but if Raymond was missing equipment, maybe he should take better care of his things. The younger men laughed and Marcus grinned, and Raymond felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, but kept his voice level and said the axe had been in his family for 3 generations, and he would appreciate its return, no questions asked. Marcus said he did not know what Raymond was talking about and had work to do, and then he pulled his safety glasses down and started his saw again, turning his back in a gesture of dismissal so complete it felt like a physical shove. Raymond drove into Havenwood and filed a report with the county sheriff's office, explaining the theft to a deputy who took notes but did not seem particularly interested. The deputy said, without witnesses or proof, there was not much they could do, but he would talk to Marcus and his crew. Raymond asked when that might happen, and the deputy said when he had time, maybe later that week, and Raymond understood that nothing was going to come of it. He spent the next 2 days asking around at the diner and the hardware store, letting people know what had happened, and the general response was sympathy mixed with the understanding that Marcus Thibault was not someone you crossed unless you were prepared for trouble. Someone suggested Raymond just buy a new axe and forget about it, and Raymond had walked out without responding, because how could he explain to someone who did not understand that you could not replace a thing like that the value was not in the steel but in the connection, in the unbroken line of hands that had gripped that handle. On November 1st, Raymond went to the bar where Marcus and his crew drank on Friday nights. He waited until Marcus came outside to smoke, and then approached him in the parking lot and asked one more time for the axe back. Marcus was drunk enough to be mean and sober enough to be coherent, and he told Raymond he did not have his axe, but if he did, he would probably sell it to some antique dealer for whatever he could get, because at the end of the day it was just a piece of old steel that did not cut half as good as a new Gransfors Brooks. Raymond said that was not the point, and Marcus said, what was the point then? And Raymond found he could not put it into words in a way that would make Marcus understand. Marcus laughed and said Raymond should run along home before he got hurt, and then he flicked his cigarette at Raymond's feet and went back inside. Raymond sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, his hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Then he drove home and called his brothers. There were 4 Leonel brothers in total. Raymond was the oldest, Then came Daniel, who was 60, then Michael, who was 56, and finally Joseph, who was 53. All four had worked timber their entire adult lives. All four had been raised by the same father with the same values. And all four understood, without needing it, explained what the theft of their grandfather's axe meant. There were also two cousins, sons of their father's brother, named Samuel and David, 52 and 48 respectively, who had worked alongside the brothers since they were teenagers, and who were considered family in every way that mattered. They met at Raymond's house on the evening of November 2nd, a Saturday, sitting around the kitchen table the way they had sat for family dinners and holidays and funerals. And Raymond laid out what had happened. He did not editorialize or exaggerate, simply stated the facts as he knew them, and when he finished, there was a long silence while the men absorbed what they had heard. Daniel, who had always been the most even-tempered of the brothers, asked if Raymond was certain it was Marcus who took the axe. Raymond said he was as certain as he could be without having seen it happen. Michael, who had a temper that ran hot, said they should go to Marcus's house and take it back, and Joseph said that would lead to trouble and the sheriff getting involved and nothing good coming of it. They talked for 3 hours, the conversation moving in circles, exploring possibilities and consequences. They talked about going to Marcus's crew and offering money, though they all knew Marcus would take that as weakness and use it against them. They talked about waiting and hoping the axe would turn up, though they all knew that was just delaying the inevitable. They talked about letting it go, about accepting that some things in life were not fair and you had to make peace with that. But every time the conversation moved in that direction, it hit a wall because none of them could make peace with it. This was not about an axe. This was about respect. This was about a man being mocked for valuing something that carried weight and meaning. About being dismissed and humiliated. About watching someone take from you the one thing you had asked them not to take, and then laugh in your face when you asked for it back. Samuel, the older cousin, finally said what everyone had been thinking, but no one had wanted to voice. He said there was a line and Marcus had crossed it. And when a man crossed that line, you either let him get away with it or you did something about it. And if you let him get away with it, then you were telling the world you were a man who could be crossed. The other men nodded slowly, and the conversation shifted from whether to what, and that was when everything changed. They did not plan it the way people plan crimes in movies. There was no discussion of alibis or escape routes or covering tracks. They simply talked about what needed to happen and accepted that whatever came after would come. Michael said Marcus's crew worked scattered sites and they would need to know where everyone was. Joseph said he had a friend who brokered timber who could probably get that information. Daniel said they should wait until the weather turned because wet, cold nights in November meant fewer people in the woods and less chance of witnesses. Raymond said nothing for a long time, and then he said, if they did this, there was no going back, and everyone needed to be certain, and each man in turn said he was certain. They spent the next 10 days gathering information. Joseph's broker friend, who owed Joseph a favor and asked no questions, provided the locations of Marcus's active sites and the names of his crew. There were 12 men total, including Marcus, spread across 5 different locations. The brothers and cousins did not discuss the specifics of what would happen, operating instead on an unspoken understanding that came from decades of working together, of knowing how each man thought and moved, of trusting each other in ways that went beyond words. On the evening of November 13th, the weather turned. A cold front pushed down from Canada, bringing freezing rain and wind, the kind of weather that kept people indoors and made the woods feel like the edge of the world. The 6 Leonel men met at Raymond's house at 8 o'clock in the evening, each arriving separately, parking their trucks in the barn behind the house where they could not be seen from the road. They did not speak much. There was nothing left to say. They checked their equipment, old tools they knew how to use, and then they divided up the locations based on who was closest to what. And at 9:45, they left in 3 separate trucks, headlights cutting through the freezing rain, windshield wipers beating a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Raymond and Daniel took the first site, a staging area where 3 of Marcus's crew kept their equipment. They arrived at 11:15 to find the area empty, the men having gone home because of the weather. Raymond felt a moment of relief, thinking perhaps this was a sign they should turn back, but then he remembered Marcus flicking that cigarette at his feet, and the relief turned to something else. They waited in the truck with the engine off, watching their breath fog the windows, and at midnight a truck pulled in, one of the younger crew members coming to check on equipment or retrieve something he had forgotten. The young man's name was Travis, and he was 24 years old and had a girlfriend who worked at the diner and a baby on the way, though Raymond did not know any of this at the time. What happened next happened quickly and without drama. Raymond and Daniel approached from behind, moving quietly the way you move when stalking deer. And Travis did not hear them until it was too late. There was a brief struggle and then silence, and Raymond and Daniel stood in the freezing rain looking at what they had done, understanding in that moment that they had become something they had not been an hour before. Daniel threw up in the woods, and Raymond put a hand on his shoulder and said they should keep moving. Michael and Joseph took 2 sites, working separately, arriving at staggered times between 11:30 and 1 in the morning. At the first site, they found 2 men working late under generator-powered lights, trying to get a load finished before the weekend. At the second site, they found 1 man asleep in his truck, engine running for heat, radio playing country music at low volume. At each site, the pattern repeated, quick and efficient and terrible, and by 2 in the morning, Michael and Joseph had rejoined and were driving toward the next location, neither man speaking, the heater in the truck blasting, but neither man feeling warm. Samuel and David took the remaining sites, the farthest ones, up in the high ridges where the roads were barely maintained and cell phone reception disappeared. They found men at 3 different locations, men who were working late or living in campers on site because they could not afford rent in town. Men who probably never knew what was happening until it was over. Samuel, who had 3 daughters and had coached youth softball for 15 years, found himself thinking about whether those men had children, whether someone would miss them the way his daughters would miss him, and the thought almost broke him, but he pushed it down because there was no room for that now. By 4:30 in the morning on November 14th, all 6 Leonel men had returned to Raymond's house. They cleaned their tools in silence, scrubbing with wire brushes and solvent, then burning the brushes and rags in Raymond's wood stove. They cleaned their hands and faces and changed their clothes, bagging everything they had worn and adding it to the fire. The smell of burning fabric and plastic filled the house, and none of them commented on it. When everything was clean and put away, they sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee as the sky began to lighten outside. The freezing rain having stopped sometime around 4, leaving everything coated in a layer of ice that made the world look crystalline and fragile. Raymond said they should turn themselves in. Michael said they should run. Joseph said there was nowhere to run to, and Michael knew it. Daniel said they should at least wait, see what happened. But Samuel said waiting would just make it worse, and they all knew the sheriff would come eventually. David, who had said very little all night, finally spoke up and said they had done what they had done, and now they had to face it. And that was what men did. They voted, and it was unanimous. At 8 o'clock that morning, still wearing their work clothes, they drove together to the sheriff's office in Havenwood and turned themselves in. The confession was straightforward. Raymond did most of the talking, explaining what Marcus had stolen and what they had done about it, providing locations and times and details the sheriff could verify. The sheriff, a man named Coleman, who had known the Leonel family for 30 years, listened without interrupting, his face growing grayer with each detail. When Raymond finished, Sheriff Coleman sat back in his chair and closed his eyes and said, "Jesus Christ, Raymond," and Raymond said he knew. The 6 men were arrested without resistance, fingerprinted and photographed and placed in holding cells, and by noon the news had spread through Havenwood and the surrounding communities like water through cracked stone. The investigation took 6 weeks. The Missouri State Police brought in forensics teams and detectives from Kansas City, and they processed each scene with the thoroughness such crimes demanded. They found evidence at every location, tire tracks and footprints and DNA, and they built a case that was airtight and undeniable. The victims were identified and their families notified. 12 families across 3 states. People who had never heard of Havenwood or the Leonel brothers, who could not understand how their sons and husbands and fathers had ended up dead in the Missouri woods over something as meaningless as an old axe. The trial began in April of 2020 and lasted 7 weeks. The defense attorney, a public defender from Springfield who was in over his head, tried to argue temporary insanity brought on by grief and disrespect. But the prosecution showed the planning and coordination, and the argument fell apart. The victims' families filled the courtroom, some weeping, some silent, all of them looking at the 6 Leonel men with expressions that ranged from hatred to incomprehension. The Leonel families sat on the opposite side, Raymond's daughter and Daniel's ex-wife and Michael's sons and Joseph's sister and the wives and children of Samuel and David, all of them looking equally shattered, caught between loving the men they had known and being horrified by what those men had done. Marcus Thibault's widow testified that she had found the axe in her husband's truck after his death, wrapped in a tarp behind the seat, and she had turned it over to the police as evidence. The axe was entered into the record and passed around the jury box, and Raymond watched 12 strangers handle his grandfather's tool with plastic-gloved hands, saw them weigh it and examine it, and set it down with expressions that said they could not understand how something so ordinary could have led to something so terrible. The verdict came back on May 21st, 2020, guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, 12 counts each, for all 6 defendants. The sentencing hearing was brief. The judge, a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who had a reputation for being tough but fair, looked at the 6 men and said she had presided over many trials in her career, but had never seen anything quite like this. She said she understood that the men felt disrespected and that something they valued had been taken from them. But she said there was no justification, none whatsoever, for what they had done. She said 12 men were dead, 12 families destroyed, and all of it over an object that could have been replaced. Raymond wanted to stand up and explain that she was wrong, that it could not have been replaced, but his attorney put a hand on his arm and Raymond stayed silent. The sentences were handed down consecutively, life in prison without the possibility of parole for each man, 6 life sentences running one after another, a mathematical impossibility that served only to emphasize the finality of what they had done. The 6 Leonel men showed no emotion as the sentences were read. They had known this was coming. They had accepted it the night they sat around Raymond's kitchen table and chose to cross the line. As they were led from the courtroom in shackles, Raymond looked back once at his daughter, a woman of 35 who looked 10 years older than she had 6 months ago, and he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," though he was not sure if he meant he was sorry for what he had done, or sorry for getting caught, or sorry that the world was built in such a way that a man could lose everything over something as simple as respect. The families of the victims filed civil suits against the Leonel families, seeking damages for wrongful death, and most of those suits were settled out of court for amounts that bankrupted everyone involved. Raymond's house was sold to pay his portion, the house where he had lived with Martha, where his children had been raised, where his father had died in the bedroom upstairs. Daniel's ex-wife lost her savings. Michael's sons dropped out of college because there was no money left for tuition. The ripples spread outward. touching lives that had nothing to do with the original crime, destroying futures that should have been secure. In the years that followed, the story of the Leonel brothers became something of a legend in the Ozarks, though not the kind of legend anyone was proud of. People told it as a cautionary tale about what happens when pride overwhelms sense, about men who valued honor more than life and paid the ultimate price for that value. The logging community split in its interpretation, some saying the brothers had been fools to throw their lives away over an axe, others saying quietly that they understood, that there were things worth dying for, even if you could not explain them to people who did not already know. Marcus Thiol's widow moved back to Louisiana with her children and tried to build a life far from the place where her husband had died. Travis's girlfriend had the baby, a boy, and raised him alone, and sometimes at night she would tell the child about his father, though she left out the parts about how he died and who killed him. The other families scattered to the winds, some staying in Missouri, others leaving and never coming back, all of them carrying a weight they had not asked for and could not set down. The 6 Leonel men settled into prison routines. They were separated and sent to different facilities across the state as a precaution, though there was never any indication they posed a security risk. Raymond ended up at a maximum security facility in Bonne Terre, where he worked in the prison workshop, making furniture that was sold to state offices. He kept to himself mostly, did not make friends, spent his evenings reading westerns from the prison library and writing letters to his daughter that she answered less and less frequently as the years went on. Daniel found religion in prison and spent his days in the chapel, praying for forgiveness he was not sure he deserved. Michael got into fights and spent long stretches in solitary confinement, unable to adjust to confinement the way the others had. Joseph taught himself to paint and created landscapes from memory, scenes of the Ozark hills in autumn, trees in full color, the kind of beauty he would never see again except in his mind. Samuel and David, the cousins, requested and were eventually granted transfers to the same facility, and they spent their recreation time together, talking about the old days, about jobs they had worked and trees they had felled, and the way the morning light looked coming through the canopy. They never talked about what they had done or why they had done it. That conversation had ended the night of November 13th, and there was no point in revisiting it. Raymond died in prison in 2027, a heart attack while sleeping, and he was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave because his daughter could not afford to have the body transported back to Havenwood. Daniel outlived him by 2 years, dying of pneumonia in the prison hospital, and his ex-wife arranged for his cremation and scattered the ashes in a creek behind her house without telling anyone. The other 4 men, as of 2025, remained incarcerated, aging into their 60s and 70s, becoming the kind of inmates that younger prisoners avoided because they carried about them an air of sadness so profound it seemed contagious. The staging area where Raymond had kept his grandfather's axe was cleared within 6 months of the arrests. The land leased to a timber company from Arkansas that worked it for 2 years and then moved on when the good trees were gone. The sites where the 12 men died were marked temporarily with crime scene tape, and then the tape came down and the woods reclaimed the spaces, leaves covering tire tracks, saplings growing where trucks had been parked, nature erasing the evidence of human tragedy with the same indifference it had always shown. Today, if you drive through Havenwood and the surrounding timber country, you will find it much the way it was in 2019, which is to say, you will find it quietly dying. The diner still opens for breakfast but serves fewer men each year. The hardware store changed ownership and now sells more lawn ornaments than tools. The mill that was still operating in 2019 closed in 2022, and the building sits empty. Windows broken, the parking lot overgrown with weeds. Young people leave as soon as they graduate high school and do not come back except for holidays and funerals, and even then they come reluctantly, uncomfortable with the weight of memory and obligation. The house where Raymond Leonel lived was bought by a family from Kansas City who used it as a vacation home for a few years before deciding the drive was too long and the area too depressing. It sat empty after that and eventually burned down under suspicious circumstances. And now all that remains is a foundation filled with blackberry vines and a chimney standing alone like a grave marker. The barn where the 6 men met that final night collapsed during a storm in 2023, and no one bothered to clear the debris. There is a woman who lives in town, one of Travis's cousins, who sometimes drives past the sites where the murders occurred. Though she could not tell you exactly why she does this, she says it is important to remember, though she is not sure what she is supposed to remember or what good remembering does. She says her cousin was a good man who made mistakes like everyone makes mistakes, and he did not deserve what happened to him. But then she stops and says, maybe no one deserves anything. Maybe things just happen, and we make up stories afterward to give them meaning. The axe itself was held as evidence until the conclusion of the trial and the appeals process, then returned to Raymond Leonel's daughter in 2023. She kept it in her closet for a year, unable to look at it, unable to throw it away. And finally, she donated it to a historical society in Springfield that displayed it for 6 months in an exhibit about Ozark logging history. The placard next to it explained that it was a 19th century double-bit felling axe used by 3 generations of the Leonel family, but it did not mention why the axe was significant or what had happened because of it. After the exhibit closed, the axe was placed in storage in the society's warehouse, boxed up with 100 other artifacts from a time and place that fewer people cared about with each passing year. On certain mornings in November, when the weather turns cold and the freezing rain falls on the Ozark ridges, there are men who work the woods who say they can feel something in the air, a heaviness that has nothing to do with the approaching winter. They cannot explain what it is or why they feel it, and most of them do not try, but they finish their work quickly on those mornings and leave the woods earlier than they planned, driving home through the rain with a sense of unease they cannot shake. Whether this is guilt or memory or simply the human need to believe that terrible things leave marks on the landscape, no one can say. The logging community in the Ozarks today is a fraction of what it was 30 years ago, and it continues to shrink as men retire and are not replaced, as the economics of the industry make it impossible for young people to make a living wage, as the forests themselves are carved up and sold off to developers who build vacation homes for people from St. Louis and Kansas City. The men who remain are older now and work alone more often than not, and when they gather at the diner or the gas station, they talk about equipment and timber prices and the weather, but they do not talk about the Leonel brothers. That subject sits between them like an open grave, acknowledged by its absence, avoided because to discuss it would require them to examine their own codes and values and ask themselves what they would have done in Raymond's place, and most of them do not want to know the answer to that question. In the end, what happened in November of 2019 was both extraordinary and mundane. A collision of old values and new economics, of men raised to believe that respect and honor mattered more than anything, discovering that the world no longer agreed with them. It was the story of a theft so small as to be almost meaningless, measured against the response it provoked, and yet to the men involved, it was not meaningless at all. It was the story of a line crossed and consequences accepted and lives destroyed over a principle that could not be quantified or explained to people who did not share it. The 12 men who died were fathers and sons and brothers, men with their own stories and dreams and failures, men who showed up to work every day and did what they had to do to survive. They did not deserve what happened to them. Their families did not deserve what happened to them. The Leonel families did not deserve what happened to them. And yet it happened anyway, because sometimes the world arranges itself in such a way that decent people do terrible things and then spend whatever time they have left trying to understand how it came to that. There is no moral to this story, no lesson that makes the tragedy meaningful or the sacrifice worthwhile. There is only the understanding that people carry inside them capacities for violence and honor that coexist uneasily, and that under the right circumstances, or perhaps the wrong ones, those capacities can overwhelm everything else, can burn through a lifetime of restraint and decency and leave nothing but ash and regret. The grandfather's axe that started all of this sits now in a storage warehouse in Springfield, wrapped in plastic and forgotten, and it will probably remain there until the Historical Society runs out of space and sells off parts of its collection, or until the building itself is torn down to make room for something more profitable. The steel that 3 generations of Leonel men gripped and sharpened and used is the same steel it always was, unchanged by the blood spilled over it, indifferent to the meaning people tried to invest in it. It is just an axe, after all, just a tool forged in a Pennsylvania factory over a century ago and used to cut wood. And if it could speak, it would probably say that the problem was never the axe itself, but what people believed the axe represented, and how far they were willing to go to defend that belief. The logging roads through the Ozark ridges are still there, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. And if you walk them on a quiet day, you can still find evidence of the industry that built this place. Old cables wrapped around trees, rusted chains half buried in leaves, the remnants of staging areas where men gathered before dawn to begin another day of hard labor. The trees that were cut have been replaced by new growth, and in another 50 years there will be timber worth harvesting again, and perhaps men will return to these hills to do the same work their grandfathers did. And perhaps they will carry with them the same values and codes and principles. And perhaps one day, one of them will be tested by a theft or an insult or a moment of disrespect, and he will have to decide how to respond. And in that moment, he might remember the story of the Leonel brothers and use it to guide his choice. Though whether that guidance leads him toward restraint or violence is something only he can determine. Sometimes the monsters we fear are not born, they are made. One broken promise, one stolen heirloom, one moment of disrespect at a time, until decent men find themselves standing in the rain at midnight with blood on their hands, wondering how they arrived at this place and whether there was ever any other path they could have taken, and concluding in the end that there probably was, but that they were too proud, or too broken, or too committed to their principles to see it until it was far too late to turn back.